Now, Locke then goes on to talk about a couple of other things, but this issue about manners and civility and discipline and proper motivation and so forth really is important to him, and he interrupts himself just a little bit later and he comes back to it again. So I want to read this passage to you as well. Locke says, "But as to this, give me leave here to inculcate again." All right, so he's interrupting himself. "What is very apt to be forgotten, namely, that great care is to be taken that education never be made as a business to him, nor he look on it as a task. We naturally, as I said, even from our cradles, love liberty, and have therefore an aversion to many things for no other reason but because they are enjoined us." All right, I'll pause there for a moment here. Locke is here sounding the theme of liberty, and this is again in contrast to the idealists who typically will emphasize obedience. Plato has the teacher dragging the student up the ascent of the cave against the student's will. Right? Education is something that has to be forced on in a top-down fashion. Kant emphasizes the number one trait that we have to instill in students is, again, obedience. Locke is on the other side of the divide here. The natural human birthright is liberty. To be a human is to make one's own choices, and we naturally want to make our own choices. And so what he is suggesting here is that parents and as educators, we need to always take that into account. Being strictly top-down and authoritarian is not then the proper form for human education to take. Instead, we need to take into account the natural and healthy human desire for autonomy, for making our own choices. Even as children, Locke says right from the cradle, we have to take this into account, inculcate it, channel it, encourage it in the appropriate directions. He then goes on to say, and I'll pick up the quotation again here, quote, "I have always had a fancy that learning might be made a play and a recreation to children, and that they might be brought to desire to be taught if it were proposed to them as a thing of honor, credit, delight, and recreation." Right? Learning is fun. That's the natural thing. It should be fun. It should be delightful. It should be a thing of honor. It should be a thing of recreation. Now Locke says here that he has it as a fancy, right? It feels natural to him, and he knows perhaps many children who are naturally curious, like to explore the world, like to develop their capacities and so forth. But at the same time, we're aware that much of education is built on a very different model, that education is a drudgery. Education is something that we have to do because our teachers tell us we have to do it. And this was, of course, a major theme in Plato, right? Plato says right from the beginning, we don't want to be enlightened. We don't want to look toward the light. It's painful. We don't want to go up the ascent of the cave. We have to be dragged up and forced to stand in the presence of the light and so forth. Kant, centuries later, in his characterization of the school, says that we have to let the children out of school once in a while, otherwise their natural joyousness will be quenched, implying that the school is not a place of natural joyousness and playfulness and so forth. Locke then is on the other side of that philosophical divide very strongly here. Education should be a pleasure. This dichotomy between fun and learning, between education and pleasure, that has to be overcome and should be overcome if education is appropriate. I think Locke is suggesting here that if we do start with children who are naturally curious, naturally enjoying learning, naturally into the process of developing their capacities, but fairly quickly into the educational process, they start to hate school. Chances are good, it's not the child's fault, but rather the school's fault. We're not approaching education appropriately. We need to recast the education system so that we're not squelching that natural tendency there as well. Okay, I now want to turn to curricular issues in Locke. Locke actually has mentioned a couple of curricular issues here, but I've followed his self-interruptions in order to focus on these themes of manners and discipline and proper motivation in education. When I first read Locke's thoughts concerning education, I had an eye out and was ready to take notes on what his curriculum consisted of, and I was struck by the very first thing that Locke mentioned as a formal curricular element, and you may be surprised, as I was when he read it here. Very first thing, I will read it to you. Nothing appears to me to give children so much becoming confidence and behavior, and so to raise them to the conversation of those above their age as dancing. I think they should be taught to dance as soon as they are capable of it. Pause. Now what's striking here is that even before he starts to talking about teaching students to read and write and do arithmetic and so forth, Locke says dancing is something that we should start to teach students formally as soon as they are capable of doing so. And I think that is striking in its own right, in that that's not normally what we put at the top of our list of curricular elements here. But I think it's also striking in this context here because the reason that Locke gives for including dance in the curriculum and making it foundation is a very realist reason for doing so. And let me read a little bit further here. For, so here comes the reason. Though this, that is to say dancing, consist only in outward gracefulness of motion, yet I know not how it gives children manly thoughts and carriage more than anything. All right, notice what he's saying here. Dancing does give one outward gracefulness of motion. Right? One is learning how to move one's body, self-control, self-discipline, grace, poise, a certain amount of endurance, right, and so forth. And then he says he doesn't know how it does this, but what dancing also does is it gives the person manly thoughts and carriage. That is to say, on the psychological side, it leads us to think a certain way, to carry ourselves intellectually and spiritually a certain way, the way a man would. So we learn to move our bodies the way a manly man moves our bodies, but we also learn to think and to be internally the way a man should be. And I think what Locke has in mind is the following. It's a point about mind-body integration, which is a major realist theme, of course. So it's one thing to focus on physical development. We want students to have strong bodies, flexible bodies, bodies with a certain amount of endurance. And so dancing pushes all of those buttons and so forth. But if we think about the mind-body integration point, if one has a strong body and has a graceful body, that lends itself to a certain amount of gracefulness intellectually and morally speaking. So it's one thing, for example, to move one's body with a certain amount of dignity, grace, and poise, to have one's shoulders squared, one's back erect, and so forth. And I can feel it myself in this, that as I am standing straight and moving right through the world, right, in a courtly fashion this way, my mind, right, and spirit seem to be much more dignified and graceful and so forth, and my voice is reflecting that. And if we think about it by contrast, you know, somebody who kind of schlumps right through the world, physically speaking, is kind of slack and so forth, it seems like that is a mirror of their internal soul. There's something kind of slack about what's going on inside their minds, right, so to speak. And of course, we can add another element here. If when boys and girls get a little bit older, we have them start dancing with each other, then boys and girls are interacting with each other in the dancing lesson. And of course, they're enjoying that, but they're also learning how to relate to each other gracefully and civilly, young man to young woman, and so that leads to all sorts of appropriate behaviors, and so it can be a vehicle for character training as well.